She had been astonished, disbelieving, delighted, and above all honored, when Miss Grayling, the head mistress of Malory Towers, had announced at the end of last term that she was to be head girl, and Susan had felt exactly the same when the head had told her that she was to be Felicity's deputy, assisting her friend with her duties. The two girls had been best friends since they were first formers, and were very close indeed. Miss Grayling knew that they would make an excellent team, for both girls were responsible, trustworthy, and kind-hearted. She could certainly rely on them to do their best for Malory Towers and its pupils. Of course, Felicity's parents had been proud and delighted too, and so had her sister Daryl, who had once been head girl of Malory Towers herself. Daryl had hugged her younger sister excitedly when Felicity arrived home for the holidays, crying, "Congratulations! Miss Grayling has made a splendid choice. I wonder if you feel as thrilled as I did when she told me that I was to be head girl." "I should rather think I do," laughed Felicity, hugging Daryl back. "Thrilled and overwhelmed, for it is a tremendous responsibility. I'm sure that you will do a splendid job," the girl's father had said, overhearing this, "just as Daryl did when she was head girl. And you will have Susan to back you up," Mrs. Rivers had added. "My goodness, it's becoming quite a family tradition, isn't it? Perhaps one day, my dears, your daughters will be head girls of Malory Towers too." This was a very pleasant thought indeed, and Felicity had beamed at her parents and sister, seeing the love and pride in their faces and feeling a warm glow inside. It was a feeling that had lasted all through the holidays and still lingered. "It's going to be a very testing term for both of us," said Felicity now. "What with our new responsibilities and studying for higher sought." The two girls were sitting in the little cafe at the railway station, waiting for the train that was to take them back to Malory Towers, and Susan gave a groan, saying, "Higher sought. That's the only thing that has spoiled what has been an otherwise marvelous holiday for me, having to spend some time studying." "Well, it will all be worth it when we pass," said Felicity sensibly, "though in some ways I can't help envying those who aren't going in for it, for they will have a nice, carefree term, while the rest of us are slaving away like mad." "Yes," said Susan with a rueful grin, "sometimes it pays to be a duffer. Nora and Delia aren't going in for it, and nor is Amy." "Bonnie is, though," said Felicity with a grin. She didn't intend to. Then June said that she thought Bonnie was very wise, for she would never pass in a million years. And, of course, Bonnie saw that as a challenge, and at once changed her mind, laughed Susan. "Jolly clever of June, for Bonnie has a good brain, if she chooses to use it." "Well, June is the one person in our form who won't have to worry about studying," said Felicity rather enviously. "She only has to read a page once to memorize it. Daryl says that her cousin Alicia was exactly the same." "Yes, it's so unfair," said Susan. "June will get top marks without even trying, while the rest of us will be burning the midnight oil and worrying whether we will manage to scrape through." "June won't get off completely scot-free though," said Felicity. "She is still game's captain, and will have to work hard at that." Just then the door of the little cafe opened, and a girl wearing the Malory Towers uniform entered. She was thin and rather plain, with straight, mousy brown hair, and her eyes looked very scared behind the big glasses she wore. Felicity and Susan guessed that she must be a new girl, and felt rather sorry for her, as she looked so nervous. As head girl, it was Felicity's duty to make her feel at ease, so she called out, "Hello there. You must be waiting for the train to Malory Towers." The girl looked at Felicity, then at Susan, her expression becoming even more scared. Then she advanced rather timidly and said in a very quiet voice, "That's right, I'm starting in the 6th form." "Well, we are in the 6th form too," said Susan. "Do sit down and join us. This is Felicity Rivers, head girl of Malory Towers, and I am Susan Blake, her best friend and deputy." This information seemed to startle the girl a little, for she blinked rapidly before sitting down and saying, "I'm Alice Johnson." My goodness, what luck to bump into the two most important girls in the school. "Well, I don't know that I would go that far," laughed Felicity. "Miss Grayling, our head mistress, would most certainly say that each girl at Malory Towers is as important as the next, and she is quite right. And a lot of the lower school would argue that our fellow sixth former, June, is the most important person in the school, said Susan. She's game's captain, you see, and most of the youngsters simply adore her. Alice smiled rather nervously at this, and quite suddenly, it struck Felicity that there was something oddly familiar about her. Then the smile disappeared, and so did Felicity's feeling that she had seen the girl somewhere before. It really was most strange. Susan glanced at the big clock that hung on the wall, saying, "I would offer you a cup of tea, Alice, but the train will be here any minute. We really should go." So the three girls left the cafe, weaving their way through groups of Malory Towers girls, mistresses and parents, until they reached a platform from which their train would leave. Miss Potts, the house mistress of North Tower, was there with a small group of excited, chattering first formers, and she greeted Felicity and Susan with a smile. "Well, girls," she said, "it is nice to see you back. I never got the opportunity at the end of last term to congratulate you both. Felicity, I am sure that you will make a fine head girl, and Susan, I know that you will do everything that you can to help." The two girls thanked Miss Potts, and nodding towards the unruly first formers, Felicity said, "It seems strange to think that one of these youngsters will one day be head girl. At the moment, it seems quite impossible to believe," said Miss Potts dryly. "Daphne, is there any need to yell like that? Katie is standing right next to you and she isn't deaf, though she may well end up that way if you keep shouting in her ear like that." "Sorry, Miss Potts," said Daphne, a slim, pretty girl with short dark curls and merry brown eyes. "Why, it's Daffy Hope," said Felicity. "Hello, Daffy. Sally told me that you were starting at Malory Towers this term, and asked me to look out for you." "Is that Sally's young sister?" asked Susan as Felicity and Alice boarded the train. "She seems a bit of a handful." "Oh no, I've met her heaps of times and she's a very nice, well-behaved kid," said Felicity. "I dare say she's just excited at going off to boarding school for the first time." Sally Hope was Daryl's best friend, and the two families had become very close over the years, so when Sally had asked Felicity to keep an eye on her young sister, she had agreed at once. It wouldn't be a very difficult task, she thought, for Daphne, or Daffy, as most people called her, was such a good kid, and not the kind of girl to get into mischief. The three sixth formers quickly found an empty carriage, and as they took their seats, Susan looked out of the window and said, "I can see June and Freddie coming along the platform. We must save a couple of seats for them." But June and Freddie did not get on the train immediately, for they were distracted by a little byplay on the platform. While the two girls stopped to greet Miss Potts, a latecomer arrived, accompanied by her mother, and it soon became evident that she wasn't in the best of moods. "I don't see why the chauffeur couldn't have driven me to school," she complained loudly. "It's simply beastly having to rough it on the train." "Now, Violet dear," said her mother rather nervously, "you know very well that Benson had to drive Daddy to an important meeting today. He could quite easily have taken a taxi," said Violet, looking sullen. "Then I shouldn't have had to get up so early. You know how I hate getting up early, Mummy." "Yes, darling, but you know that you will have to get used to it when you are at school," her mother said. "You will get into awful trouble if you sleep in and are late for breakfast, you know." "It's too bad," said Violet, looking as if she were about to burst into tears. "There will be all sorts of beastly rules that I shall have to keep, and I shan't be able to have my own way at all." And Violet was used to getting her own way, thought June, watching the little scene in amusement, a little too used to it, by the look of things. Violet was a short, plump girl with carefully curled golden hair, rather small gray eyes, and a turned-up nose, as though she has a bad smell under it, murmured Daffy Hope to the little group of first formers, giving a sniff and imitating Violet's high and mighty expression. The first formers giggled at this, and June, overhearing, had to hide a grin as she glanced at Daffy. She didn't know who this cheeky little first former was, but she had certainly hit the nail on the head. The spoilt Violet, meanwhile, was just complaining to her mother about how ugly the school uniform was, and as she stamped her foot angrily, Miss Potts decided to take a hand in the matter. "Good morning," she said, going across and holding out her hand to Violet's mother. "You must be Mrs. Forsyth, and this, I presume, is Violet. I am Miss Potts, house mistress of North Tower." Mrs. Forsyth shook Miss Potts's hand and said, "I'm pleased to meet you, Miss Potts. I'm afraid that Violet is feeling a little under the weather today. You see, she has always had a governess before and has never been to school. You must understand that she is rather nervous." Miss Potts had met Violet's type before and quickly sized her up as a spoilt mother's girl. The child wasn't nervous at all, merely furious that she was being sent away to school where she would have to do as the others did and wouldn't be able to get her own way by throwing tantrums. Well, perhaps Malory Towers would do her good, and Violet would learn to settle down and be sensible. Miss Potts, glancing round at the other first formers who were looking at Violet with a mixture of contempt and amusement, certainly hoped so, or things would be very difficult for the girl. The mistress had also sized up Mrs. Forsyth, a pleasant enough woman, but rather weak and silly. Her lips were beginning to tremble now, and Miss Potts knew that if she was not firm there would be a long and emotional farewell, which would not do either Violet or her mother any good at all. So she laid a firm hand on Violet's shoulder and said briskly, "Come along then, Violet. Say goodbye to your mother quickly, please. Then pick up your night case and get on the train." Both Violet and her mother looked rather affronted at being robbed of their dramatic farewell, but neither of them dared flout the stern Miss Potts, so they had to content themselves with a brief hug and promises to write. Then the first formers, along with June and Freddie, moved towards the train, Daffy Hope managing to position herself behind Violet and sticking her tongue out behind her back. Once again, June's lips twitched. What a naughty little monkey that girl was, yet there was something rather likable about her. Violet, however, thought differently, for she turned round just in time to see Daffy with her tongue out and scowled at her. Before she could say anything to Daffy, though, June said firmly, "Get on the train at once, please. You're holding everyone up." Violet turned her scowl on June, but one look at the sixth former's face warned her that it would be most unwise to argue. Quickly lowering her eyes from June's, Violet turned away and clambered aboard the train. Miss Potts remained on the platform, waiting for any stragglers, while June and Freddie joining. The other three sixth formers were greeted warmly. The two newcomers looked at Alice curiously, and Felicity said, "This is Alice Johnson, our new girl. Alice, this is June, our school games captain, and her friend, Freddie Holmes." Alice gave her nervous smile and greeted the two girls in her quiet voice, while June's sharp eyes narrowed. "Have I met you somewhere before?" she asked. "Oh no," said Alice, shaking her head. "We have never met before." "That's odd," said June, "for there's something familiar about you. Perhaps you remind me of someone, though I can't for the life of me think who it is at the moment." "Never mind. I'm sure it will come to me." Alice looked quite terrified at this thought, and Felicity said, "That's funny, because earlier on I thought that I recognized you too, though I'm quite sure we have never met. Have you ever had a sister at Malory Towers?" "No, I'm an only child," answered Alice. She had turned rather red, and Freddie, guessing that the girl didn't like being the center of attention, quickly changed the subject and began telling the girls about Violet Forsyth. "My goodness, she sounds a perfect little beast," said Susan. "Well, Miss Potts won't stand any nonsense from her," said Felicity. "I don't think the first form kids will either," said June with a smile. "One of them in particular seems an imp, and she soon let Violet know what she thought of her. I don't know the kid's name, but she was a pretty little thing, dark, curly hair and laughing brown eyes." "Why, that sounds like Daffy Hope," said Felicity. "Sally's sister, really," said June, raising her dark brows in surprise and saying rather mockingly, "I would never have guessed, for she's the opposite of solid, sensible Sally." "Nonsense," said Felicity. "I can't think why you believe that she's an imp, June. And Susan, you said that she looked like a handful, but you're both quite wrong, for she's every bit as sensible and responsible as Sally. Is she? Said June, with a quizzical look at Felicity. Or are you sure that you aren't mistaken? Felicity? In the first form carriage, meanwhile, Daffy Hope was quickly establishing herself as leader of the first form, the others liking her mischievous nature and sense of fun. For June and Susan were quite right. There were two sides to Daffy Hope. The sweet, well-behaved girl that her family was so proud of was very different from the Daffy her school friends knew. Indeed, Mrs. Hope had been most upset when the form mistress at Daffy's prep school had spoken to her about the girl's naughty behavior. Daffy had talked her way out of it easily, convincing her mother that the mistress had got her confused with another girl called Daphne, and for the rest of the term she had not dared misbehave. But now that she was away from home and her parents, it was quite another matter. Daffy was at a slight advantage to the others, for while they were alone and feeling rather shy and nervous, she had her best friend from prep school with her. Katie was Daffy's partner in mischief and ably seconded her friend as she kept the first form in stitches. One person who was not impressed with Daffy, however, was Violet. The only thing that had made her agree to come to school was the thought that she would be able to lord it over the others. She had pictured them vying for her friendship, but instead they were all over that silly Daffy. It simply wouldn't do. Simply wouldn't do. So Violet raised her voice and said to the carriage at large, "It was my birthday last week. Single quotes. And no one quite knew what to say to this, so there was an awkward silence. Then the girl went on. Mummy and Daddy bought me a kitten for a present. But it's not just an ordinary kitten, you know. It's a pedigree Siamese and worth an absolute fortune. It would make you stare if I told you how much Daddy had paid for it." The girls were staring in disbelief, but Violet decided that their silence meant that they were very impressed indeed, and went on boastfully. "She sleeps in her own special bed, lined with velvet, you know, and has her own toys, and she is fed on chicken and fish, not shop bought cat food like ordinary cats. Her name is Princess Willow, but I just call her Willow for short." "Why not call her Princess instead?" asked one of the first formers, Maggie, who felt a little uncomfortable that no one was responding to Violet. "Oh, it's so silly," said Violet, putting her hand up to her mouth and giving a little giggle. "You see, Princess is Daddy's nickname for me, so we couldn't give my kitten the same name." "What a lovely nickname," said Daffy very sweetly. "You know, Violet, I think we should give you a nickname too. Don't you agree, girls?" The others, ready to agree to anything Daffy said, nodded eagerly. While Violet smiled at this, she had read several school stories and knew that only the most popular girls were given nicknames. She really had made a good impression. Daffy smiled at her and said, "Yes, I've come up with a very good nickname for you, Violet, Your Highness." "Oh," said Violet, rather surprised at this odd choice of nickname. "Is that because you think I look like a princess?" "No," answered Daffy. "It's because you're high and mighty. You're always on your high horse, and you've always got your nose stuck high in the air." The others roared, while Violet turned red with rage and gave an infuriated squeal. "Even her voice is high," laughed Katie. Violet simmered with rage. How dare that horrid Daffy make fun of her? Oh, she was going to hate it at Malory Towers. She just knew it. With no one to spoil her and pet her, or take her side against these beastly girls. If only she could persuade her parents to take her away.